Hey, schön, dass du wieder da bist, hier bei Die Kraft der Geschichten, dein Podcast für Inspiration und Lebensfreude. Ich freue mich, dass du wieder dabei bist. Heute habe ich ein ganz besonderes Interview für dich. Ich habe nämlich meinen Mentor, den intuitiven Geschichtenerzähler Leo Sofer, im Interview zu Gast. Er kommt aus Devon in England und ich habe einmal einen Kurs bei ihm besucht. Und ich kann es nur jedem empfehlen, der sich mit Geschichten beschäftigt oder überhaupt künstlerisch, schöpferisch tätig ist, diesen Zugang zur eigenen Intuition zu finden. Das ist so wertvoll. Das Interview ist auf Englisch und wenn du auf YouTube das anschaust, dann kannst du die deutschen Untertitel mitlesen. Und bevor es losgeht, habe ich noch eine Ansage für dich. Mein Storytelling-Online-Kurs, der beginnt am 12. April. Er geht einen Monat bis zum 9. Mai und du kannst dich jetzt anmelden auf annikahofmann.de. Das wird eine abenteuerliche Reise zu dir selbst. Und ich freue mich, wenn du dabei bist. Und jetzt wünsche ich dir ganz viel Freude mit dem heutigen Interview. A very warm welcome to my interview guest of today, Leo Sofer from Devon in England. You are my mentor and intuitive storyteller, trainer for intuitive storytelling, and father of 2 teenagers as well. Very welcome to my podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Annika.
As you might imagine, my first question is, how did you become an intuitive storyteller?
Well, I didn't plan on becoming an intuitive storyteller at all. It really wasn't something I was intending to do. It really happened to me. But it kind of arose out of a really deep spiritual yearning that I'd had since I was a teenager. And from that early age, I had this really clear sense there's something missing in our culture. There's something wrong with our culture. And there wasn't much to give me this sense. I mean, it wasn't like I was growing up in a family that would say, oh yeah, there's something missing, go looking for it. I grew up in a middle-class family in London, very, very sort of intellectual, professional, academic. My mother was a journalist with the Times, my father was a lawyer. So very much the focus was the mind and how great the mind is and how the rational human's attempt to work life out has been a success. No, we've got this nailed. This was the 70s and the 80s, and it was sort of before the kind of malaise that's now set in, where in the West, people are going, wait a sec, we've got something really wrong here with climate change, with all kinds of things that are happening. We're looking around going, wait, something's wrong. So we're really out of balance. We're really out of balance. Back there, my sense was the view I got from the culture I grew up in was very triumphalist. It was like, we've got this nailed. We've sorted out our problems. We've even fought the last war with the Second World War. That's done with. We've solved technological issues. We've now got, everything is sorted. Humanity is on the rise and the ascendant. And I was just looking at all of this as a teenager and thinking, great, yeah, this is how it is. And then this thing got me. This thing really bit me, which was a sense that there's much more to life. There's something unfathomably large that we're in the middle of and that no one is noticing, and no one's naming it in the culture. No one's going, there is this vast sea of consciousness that humanity is part of. We're all part of this vast sea of consciousness, which is what all the stories did for our ancestors. All the stories, all the myths and the legends for thousands of years, stretching back further and further than even literature stretches back, for tens of thousands of years, back before we had writing, before we had civilization, the stories that our ancestors told were these big, massive stories that would leave us in a space of mystery. That was almost the point, or at least it was a byproduct of these stories. They would talk about how the world came into being, where it all came from, why we're here, what the purpose of us being here. And all of that would be framed in mythological language, you know, the language of symbols, the language of mystery, of magic, of things that we don't see, but we feel are true, or we kind of know is true. So a dragon in a story, you never see a dragon with your eyes, not in normal daily life, but we kind of know what a dragon is in some way. If we have a story that's all about a dragon, we know what that means. This scary thing that's always guarding something, or that's terrifying us all the time. You know, that's a dragon, and it works as a symbol. So this is what we lost. And as a teenager, growing up in London in this sort of triumphalist, rational culture of, yeah, we did it, we got this sorted, humanity is the best. What I was receiving, what I was in the context of, is a culture stripped of mythic language, stripped of mythology, stripped of its symbolic power, because science just destroyed religion in the last couple of 100 years. There's no kind of spiritual center to our culture anymore. There's no mythic center to our culture anymore. We got rid of all the stories from the Bible. We got rid of all the stories from mythology. We got rid of all the folk tales. And all that we're left with is just superficial culture that says, all you can see and all you can touch and all you can feel, that's it, everybody. That's all we've got. And we're spinning on a planet in the middle of a meaningless universe, and yet we have a yearning for meaning. Now what are you going to do? And I think that's the torture of humanity in the modern world. That's the torture of the modern human. We feel like we have meaning, we need meaning, but we're in a universe devoid of meaning that our science has told us is just this random mistake, or kind of, it just happened like that. Beautifully put together, but ultimately a machine in which there's no deeper meaning and there's no purpose. So I couldn't have articulated all of that when I was a teenager, but that was the fire that bit me. There was the sense of, what on earth? And a few years after that, I found storytelling as a kind of like, oh, this is what we need. We need stories. I mean, you've got a similar path yourself of discovering storytelling and wanting to tell these stories as a way almost of bringing healing. And so that was what I was about. I was like 21 years old. I was storytelling. I was going for it like crazy, and finding something deeply meaningful in that the act of telling a story, it kind of evokes magic. You're evoking a sense of magic in your listener and in yourself. And as you do that, something really special happens. Something really magical can start to happen between you. And there's something hard to name, and I call it the golden thread, is when a storyteller's really on fire, they're really in touch with something magical in themselves. Just by their words, they can evoke magic in the other person. And what I mean by that is a reflectiveness of their own divine mystery. They become reflective. They become open to their divine mystery inside. And a good story can do that. I mean, it doesn't even have to be a story about divine mystery. It can be a story just about something mysterious or something open or something magical. To get someone listening deeply, you're already bringing them closer to the mythic realm, which is a doorway to our divine potential. So I was just having a great time with that. And I did that for about 7 years and told lots and lots of folk tales. I studied folk tales for like all of that time, and became really immersed in the language of the European folktale. The European folktale, with all its color, with all its characters, with all its, you could say, rhythms of story. It's kind of quite predictable rhythms if you read enough of these stories. They have a structure, and that structure informed how we do stories even today. So even today, watching TV, watching the movies, we've got a structure in our minds of how we think a story should go. And that started with the folk tales that in Western culture, everybody grew up with, our culture grew up with. So that was me. I was 28 years old, and then intuitive storytelling just came along and whacked me round the head. And that was the beginning of that. So that's a long answer to your question.
What do you mean wrecked you on the head? Like you did this folk telling story all the day, every day, and then you just said, oh, no, I'm going to tell intuitive stories. Oh, how did it change?
Well, it started as a pressure. It started as a you could call it a psychic pressure. And it was rather unbearable, to be honest. I was living alone in a cottage on the edge of Dartmoor, which is a wild part of southern England. It's where I live now, actually, but at that time it was a different side of the moor. And it was very solitary. I had no social life. I was just reading folk tales all the time and going out to schools and telling stories and then coming back home again and being alone. And I would often meditate or just listen to the stillness. And it was like I was cultivating listening, a sensitivity to my inner world. I didn't really have a meditation practice, but I would just sit still and listen very deeply. It was very quiet. And I became accustomed to that sort of inner flow or that inner space. Reading the folktales helped. They kind of opened me to an interiority. And that's what a good folktale will do. It will kind of draw you into your own inner landscape. So immersing myself in that was part of it. Sitting in stillness was another part of it. My cottage was incredibly quiet. It was, the walls were like that thick, you know, like really, really, well, maybe thicker. You can't see it on the screen, but it was probably like 1.5 meters thick at the base. And then they tapered up towards the ceiling. It's made of mud and straw. So it meant on the ground floor, it was like a sound box. You couldn't hear anything. It was utterly still. And I was in the middle of the countryside. So it was an amazing experience of just listening to stillness. And what that did for me after growing up in London, just really listening to stillness. And then another thing that was happening in that time was that I started to hear an inner voice. Now, in our culture, inner voices are often associated with psychosis. If you start hearing voices, you're in trouble. You should go and see someone and get some drugs to dampen the voices down. In shamanic cultures, and if you go back 10,000 years in humanity's history, everywhere was a shamanic culture. Everywhere there'd be one woman or man or young child, you know, that whoever, the culture would get good at spotting who was sensitive, who could walk between the worlds, who was able to listen to the spirit voices or the animal voices or however they would frame that other world, but who could also live in a body in this human experience. And often these people, I mean, they're all over the place now. We still have these people, but they're not treated with the same respect. You know, often these people would really need help. They'd need support. They need to be nurtured. And often the cultures would have they would have a way of nurturing these people. They'd spot them early and they'd nurture them and bring on their gifts. Typically an older shaman would work with the younger one and bring on their sensitivity, such that their capacity to walk between the worlds would be a blessing to the culture. And it's quite clear that most of the best images that populate our mythologies have come from these walkers in two worlds. They'd go into the dream time. They'd see the visions. They'd come back and tell the dreams. And those would become stories that would become part of the culture's mythology. So this is how we've always made stories. We've always made stories by going between the worlds, the visionary world, the interior world, and bringing it into form, into metaphor, into symbols, into stories. Well, so I started hearing voices, but by this stage, this doesn't bother me. I'd been reading enough spiritual books and so on to go, oh, well, that's interesting. Not to regard it as a problem, but just to go, fascinating. Wow, this is great. But they'd be very, very practical stories, practical messages. It would be things like, stop eating, you've had enough. Yeah, kind of really useful. Or go downstairs. The mail has come. I didn't hear anything, but I'd go downstairs and there'd be a letter on the doormat. Oh, great. But really practical, simple stuff. But it was very clearly a voice speaking. And I kind of had the beginnings of a relationship with it, to trust it, to honor it, to do what it tells me. I mean, it's not telling me to jump off cliffs, so there's not a big deal. But if it says stop eating, I stop. If it says courgettes rather than carrots, I'd go, okay, courgettes. Not questioning it, just playing with what does it feel like to be obedient to this? Where does that take me if I'm obedient? And then another factor in my preparation for intuitive storytelling was that I found that to bring the stories that I was telling really alive, a good method that I'd learned from some other storytellers that I trusted and liked is to visualize the story as you're telling it. And if you do that, your story comes alive for the people you're telling it to in a mysterious way. We communicate so much more than just with our voices. And of course, we communicate with our visuals. But I believe we also communicate our interior world. It's part of what we communicate, particularly if we're in person with people, particularly if we're sitting in a room and we're telling a story. If our interior world is kind of devoid of imagery, if we're not seeing anything as we're telling the story, there's a whole channel that's missing in the communication. So if we're telling a story, but we're seeing the story, we're watching it, we're going through it, we're noticing details we hadn't seen before, then people get that. So all of the things that I just mentioned, they were preparation for intuitive storytelling to happen. And when I teach people intuitive stories, I often bring in all of these pieces as a way of giving people the tools to learn how to do this for themselves. But for me, I was just, accidentally gathering all of these pieces. It was just what was happening while I was being a storyteller and living the way I was living. But like I said, there was also this sense of pressure, really strong pressure. And it gave me this feeling of like, I've got to leave this cottage that I'm in. I'm stifling myself. I was going a bit mad. I mean, not literally, but just kind of like, I've got to get out. I've got to see somebody. I've got to do something, blow off this energy, because the longer I was there, the more the energy would build up inside of me. I felt like I was going to burst. And then I burst. Like the cork popped, and I had a series of extraordinary experiences wherein I would start to see a story in my mind's eye, and it would come as a series of images, but they weren't images of a folktale that I already knew. They were images of a story I'd never heard before. It was a brand new story. And my inner voice stopped being so practical and started becoming like a prompt on the side of the stage, that if you go to the theatre and an actor forgets their lines, the prompt at the side of the stage goes, whispers the line across the stage so that the actor can go, right, thank you, I'm on again. I started getting a prompt in my inner voice. It would say, the dragon is now going into the, whatever I couldn't see visually, my voice would tell me. So sometimes whole lines of dialogue would come. So there I was, with a sense that whatever was inside of me that had been building up in pressure, that had finally got my attention and had this thing to tell me. And it was a story. It was a story that told, it had a certain message, and the message was always a spiritual one. It was like my inner voice, my inner world, my inner teacher had found a way of communicating with me through stories, through mythology, that mythological language. And that was how it started. That was intuitive storytelling.
Wow. I mean, I have experienced it. I was sitting in the audience once and listening to a story that you were telling intuitively. I was just amazed. It was true magic for me happening. It was like, wow, how is this possible? Like me training to learn stories, to tell stories. I think every storyteller should do this training with you, because it opens up this whole inner world, and it's possible to learn it, which I couldn't imagine it would be. And yeah, but how is this creative process working? I mean, you already told a bit of it, but maybe I ask this question once again, like, how does a story evolve? How do you create a story?
Yeah. So what I've learned over the years is that my inner storyteller, which is how I frame this, my inner storyteller loves questions. And the deeper the questions, the juicier the stories. So if I come with a really juicy question, something that's really, really got a lot of aspects to it, or it's ripe with a kind of sense of, I don't know, I have no idea what to do now. Or this is just a great big mystery. What does this even mean for us? So the bigger the questioning, the bigger the request for a story, the more full the answer can be. So that's a key part of intuitive storytelling, is that you are effectively going to the boundary between this world and the other world. You're going to that place. And if you go to that place, best to go with a sense of humility, but also a deep sense of curiosity, and furthermore, a clear request. People have understood those things with regard to all spiritual work forever. You need to come with an open heart and a big question and a specific request. And then the unseen worlds will speak to you. They'll come, they'll sense your sincerity. This is someone who really wants and is coming with humility about this. It's not a grab thing. It's not a, yeah, give me that stuff. I want some of that intuitive stuff, or I want some of the riches. No, you have to come really open and empty. But then to have something in your heart that you really want to know, something in your heart that you really want to be curious about, or a deep wish to share these treasures with other people. So if it's a personal wish for a story, that's fine. But if it's also you want to, as in my case, most of the time, I want to create material that I can share with people, then it's with equal humility and open-heartedness. I go and I say, this is what I want. This is what I'd like to share. Or this is the question I want to explore. Can you give me a story? So that's one part of it. That's what I've learned over the years is necessary.
So even for you, it's sometimes a surprise what comes out in the end. You don't know before.
It's always a surprise.
That's fantastic.
I never know what's coming. I never know what's coming. And another of the things that I learned early on is that the mind is not helpful when it's in charge. So with this kind of work, and this applies to all intuitive work, the mind is great. I mean, if we didn't have a mind, we couldn't even be speaking right now. And if I didn't have a mind, I couldn't tell stories. I wouldn't be able to string the sentences together. That's great. I need my mind. It's a useful servant. But the mind can also get overbearing and overactive and overreach and say, I know where this story is supposed to be going. It's about 3 princesses and they all go to that. And then I know what happens with the third one because it's kind of obvious now. And that's when I've messed it up. I've stepped away from the open receptivity and I've got excited by my own mind and perhaps also my desire for this to work, for it to kind of hang together. I want a good story out of this. I want something that people are going to like. And then that's where the control comes in, and that's when you kill it. Or rather, it's simply where you stepped back from the threshold and you're no longer communicating with the other world. You're in your own world, you're in your own head. And that's okay, but it's not intuitive storytelling anymore.
That's so wise. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. How can
it feels more like hard won experience, actually. It's just how it is.
Mm-hmm. How can people find your stories? Where can people find them?
Okay, I have 2 sites of my storytelling. One is Stories of the Journey Home, and that's stories for adults. And on there, I also have a training that people can download. It's an online training, or rather a home study training. I also do coaching to support people in that. And that teaches people how to do intuitive storytelling. And it includes most of what I've just said and more. And then for parents, I've got a site called Palace of Stories, where parents can download stories for their children to listen to. So there's like 100 audio stories there. And these are all stories that have come through this intuitive process. They came through my experience of being a parent and telling intuitive stories to my children every night. And also on that site, there's a course quite similar to the first one that I just mentioned, but this is just for parents. So it's how to tell intuitive stories to your own children. And that draws on all the same ingredients, but also with the added application of telling stories to children specifically.
Very good. I would recommend to every parent and to every storyteller to do this training. I think it's really good to connect to this inner wisdom, and you take people by the hand to lead them to their inner wisdom, which is just fantastic.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, people often, I think one of the things that people most get from the training is the relationship to their inner wisdom, as you call it. And that's
like, okay, there is something coming up. It's not just empty space or something. It wasn't just there's coming images, a voice, whatever people get. It's different, but something is there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's a very profound thing for people to have, that relationship and to trust that relationship. And it's like all relationships, it's ongoing. It continues to develop.
Mm-hmm. I have one last question. When you imagine you had a long, good life, you're sitting under a tree in spring, a blossoming tree under the tree on a bench. As an old man, someone is coming by, a young man, seeing you sitting there confident, relaxed, and he says, "Oh, wow, Leo, what would be your advice for me, like being a young man going into struggling with life, and what would you tell me?"
Oh, wow. Wow. Recognize that whenever you see a beautiful young woman and your heart goes, that it's not actually her that you want. It's rather your divine soul calling you. That whenever you see someone so beautiful, your heart seems to be exploding, but she walks on by and you know that she's so beautiful, you'll never get to be with her. Remember, the promise of that divine beauty is inside of you. Everything that you'd want as you look at her, as you imagine a life together, everything is to be found from the internal relationship with your own divine soul. So the world is going to pull you out. It's going to pull you into imagery. It's going to pull you in to all these lovely, pretty women that you see everywhere. Or pretty men, if that's what you like. But they're everywhere, these images of beautiful people. And they'll call you and they'll pull you. But it's not real. What you're really looking for, what you're really called by, is the deep plunge into the inner relationship and all the beauty and all the magic and all the love and all the kindness and all the courage and all the good things. They are all to be found there, right there. And if you don't believe this, then listen to as many stories as you can. And sit down. I'll start telling you one right now. That's what I'd say to him.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your time, for sharing all this juicy wisdom of your experiences. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's been a real pleasure.
People will find you on the places you have told already, and I will put this in the show notes and in the email as well. So maybe you get some visits. I hope you get many. Thank you.
Thank you so much.